This is an introduction to how I started climbing.
I would too. When I started, there were no women.
When I
Hardest climb right there.
when I was in the Army, we found out at Fort Belvoir that one could take a furlough and travel to Europe on a military air transport free. So I also, another guy and I decided we'd save up our furlough. We did, took a 50-day furlough, and I thought, why not call the Pentagon and see if they'd be interested in something like. So I called some colonel in the Pentagon. I was a private, by the way, and said, hey, we're going to do this, and we may write a story. And so the colonel writes out a letter for us to carry it. Said, give these two soldiers any help they may need.
Hold the mic a little closer so they can.
Oh, like that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Eat it.
Okay. So, so everywhere we went, starting from French Morocco at that time, to Naples, to all the way up into Italy, then over into Germany and Austria, and then up the Rhine to Paris, and finally back to England and out. There's always a photographer in an Army Jeep waiting for us to take us around to all these towns. So we had a very grand tour of Europe, courtesy of the Army. And one of the key points was, this was in Naples, the photographer said to the lifeguard, would you find somebody that could pose with these two soldiers? So this Moroccan lifeguard went down and he'd point to a woman down below, and the photographer said, hey, no, and point to a couple of others, and finally he said, okay, this one. And he picks her up and brings her up, and she sits down on the railing next to us. And you must realize that I was very unsophisticated at the time, being from Chicago, and I had never seen a strapless bathing suit with, on her arm, one of her arms there's a snake-like gold bracelet on her upper arm, 2 or 3 wraps around, and I thought that was pretty damn exotic. And then she had high heels on, so she wasn't really going to be swimming. And so that was the start of Naples. Okay, next slide. And then we got up to Rome, and I found that they were filming Roman Holiday. So I went over and talked to Audrey Hepburn. I'm kneeling there in the red shirt, and talked with her a while she was having her hair redone. And the PR guy said, hey, why don't you come, when we take another break, why don't you come in with Cary Grant and Audrey and Gregory Peck. And so I did. So I had a little afternoon break with them. And so that was a rather interesting break in my travel. Next slide. And then I went to Salzburg and went to a USO and asked the people at the USO, where are the salt mines, which I would expect would be near Salzburg. And she deflected my query and said, well, why don't you come and climb with Hans and I? So I said, that's a great idea. So she said, okay, go back to Innsbruck, buy a pair of Kletterschuhe, go take a certain streetcar and certain bus, and finally go up the trail. And this is my walking up the trail. And okay, next slide. And then you spend the night on a hut up there and climb a local mountain up there, and then come down in the next valley. And all of this sounded very nice, simple, because that's the way we used to give directions in Chicago, 5 blocks north, 3 blocks east, so whatever. So this is in the next valley over. There they were waiting as they were on the street corner. And next slide. And we walked up to this hut, which is hardly a hut. And it's right, it has you can't quite see it, but there's a little berm behind the hut to deflect any avalanches that may push it off the cliff. So next slide. This is a mountain she thought we should climb. So I spent one day with them in which we did what she said was a cow mountain, anything a cow could walk up. I passed that test, and then the next day we started up, and this is called Plesher Tribulum. It's the most pinnacle-like of the three tribulums, and it's right on the Italian border. Next slide. And this is near the start of the climb. We're looking down 4,500 feet. And at that point, that's Italy. And at that point, I said, hey, I'm getting a little scared. And she said, oh, okay, here's the rope. And here's how to tie a single loop around your waist with a bowline, and that's it. You're protected. So climb, next slide. That's Frida. And there's an overhang here, and a cable hanging down. And she says, I don't feel like I could climb that, pull up that cable today. And Hans is very retiring. He doesn't say anything. And I thought, well, hey, I climbed a rope in a gymnasium in Chicago at nearly sea level. There should be no problem. So I volunteered to climb it. So I climbed up the overhanging, and I barely got to the top because I found out there's something called the problem of altitude. And then I got up at the top and I said, what shall I do now? And she said, well, you go over the corner and you sit down somewhere and brace your legs against something so that you can't be pulled off. And then take the rope and put it around your back, and with two hands, you pull in with one and pull up with the other. And that way you can give me a belay as I climb. I said, oh, okay. They seem very logical things to do. So we did that. Next slide. And this is what the climb was like up this sort of narrow little gully. And somewhere along the line, there are two German guys ahead of us, and the rocks began coming down because they were being a bit sloppy. And you know how the rocks, when they start, if you've been in the mountains, you hear this thing of ricocheting. There's a bing, 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 whoosh, and it's that swoosh which makes you feel better because it missed you. And so she said, okay, now if we hear this again, the best thing to do is stand up as close as you can to the wall and stand as straight as you can, hugging the wall, and don't bend over, but stand as straight with your head right, the back of your head touching the rock wall, and then put your forearm over the top of your head like this, and that way, if a rock comes, all it's going to do is just break your arm, and it won't hurt your skull. So you'll be all right. So next slide. And we do get up to the top, and it turned the top was so small that they had to put me on belay as I took my little miniature tripod and put it at the very edge of the. In fact, it was about the size of the gendarme that fell, if you can imagine being up. And so I was able to get this one photograph of the three of us on that little tiny pinnacle top.
What year is this?
What?
What year is this?
51.
1951, I think.
Or 52, maybe. Yeah. By the way, I'm bad on dates. Okay, next slide. And so that's what we had climbed. We were up on around the corner on the right, climbing. We were on the corner around to the right, climbing, and going to an Austrian custom, you sort of add a little rock to the cairn, saying, "I'm glad I'm back." So, next slide. And then back here, I found through the PATC, the mountaineering section, and I started going out with them. And this is one of the real old timers, Don Hubbard. Notice the shoes he's wearing. You know, in fact, that was unusual to be wearing those. Most people just climbed in sneakers. Next, that's Arnold Wexler. He and I climbed together for a while. In fact, somewhere along the line, next slide. Art Lembeck. I think he was involved with Arnold on testing ropes or dynamic belaying, I believe. Next slide. Some women climbers. I can't remember their names now. Or even, maybe it's Bob Mole in the back. But next slide. Next slide. Yeah. This is Gert, who named Gert's Grungy Gully.
Oh, that's okay.
So now you know who was behind the name. Next slide. And here's Tony Solar demonstrating a perfect layback. Like the way one ought to handle cracks without trying to put your hands in and put your foot in at a crazy angle. But just a beautiful example of how a layback could be done. And you notice he's wearing tennis shoes. Next slide. Damn, I can't remember who that is, sorry. But he's an old timer. Next slide. Oh, and we just heard this week that Bob Robinson died. He was the author. He was the author of the first guidebook, the Little Red Book, and I did the illustrations for it. And when I asked him what did he do at the embassy, British Embassy, and he said, "Oh, I'm a gardener." And later, it turns out in his obituary that he was a lawyer. So somehow in Washington, you don't probe too far as to what they say their occupations are. Anyway, that's on trial. There are a group of us who were trying to do, before it became named, Shipley's, Triple S. Yeah. And that's, some people got a little further than that. But obviously, we had to wait for Jimmy to complete it. Next slide. Whoop. Well, one of the women is Kate Adams, and
There we go.
Yes. I think Kate Adams is the one on the left. Next slide. And this is where we practiced dynamic belaying. That is at Carter Rock, that is Oscar, and that's when you learned how to belay down at the ground, you went up there and watched somebody pull Oscar higher, and then when you weren't being attentive to how you pulled the rope in, somebody triggered it to catch you off guard and hoped you would be able to stop Oscar.
And is that a hip belay?
Pardon?
Is that a hip belay, a butt belay?
Yes, a hip belay.
Yeah, wow.
Yes.
And for how many years did you guys teach that?
I don't know.
Like a bunch?
Yeah, oh no, this went on for maybe 10, 15 years.
Okay, a long time then.
Yeah. Enough to make everybody want to learn how to belay. Next slide. And then the interesting thing about the mountaineering sections is that they just didn't do ordinary things. This is doing an aerial traverse because, you know, someday if you're in the mountains, you may have to cross a torrent. And so one practiced doing these things for fun. And that's rather difficult to crawl across like that without tipping over. If you happen to be stronger in one leg than the other, you generally would flip over.
Is that Great Falls?
Yes. Next slide. And finally, here's the old bridge at Seneca. Next slide. We used to camp at Armentrout's campground down because it had also he didn't charge anything, and yeah, right, and there was an excellent swimming hole there. So you can see in the background there's some, obviously we're using Army mountain tents. Next slide. And Arnold and I decided to rent out Buck's little house across the creek there. And we took 1 or 2 weekends, I think, of going through a garage sale, I won't say garbage, but garage sales in the local area. And that's how we furnished the little cabin. I think we had to buy a stove. And since Arnold and I both loved to cook, we often entertained.
Where was the cabin, John?
Across, opposite, yeah. Yes, it's now painted brown and it looks like it's been enlarged.
It has been enlarged.
Next slide. That is the renowned pine tree for the pine tree route, and as you can see, you could sort of step up. I think there's a piton driven in it, so you could step up like that climber is. And the trouble though is when you stepped up on it, the tree moved away from the rock, and so you began doing a big split. So you had to be sort of fast and trying to go up using the pine tree.
Is that the changeling?
Pardon?
Is that the changeling? Or what climb is that?
That's it is
pine tree.
Pine tree route on Old Man.
Okay.
No, on Coxcomb.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a view everybody knows.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. That's me sitting on top of the Coxcomb. Let's see, I guess I've got a little. Right there, that's the Coxcomb, which many of you haven't seen, which many of you I don't think have seen. And that's the top of it, and you rappelling off this side gave you a free rappel, and we did that in body rappels. And one time I had a party of 3 of us, and I led up and then arranged for them to rappel down, body rappels on the east side, and a storm was coming up, and I had trouble getting into a body rappel because the wind had come, as it came through from the west, came through the notch. The wind was so strong that it blew the 120-foot rope I had up over my head into the eastern side. And so I had to reach up into the sky and pull the rope down in order to continue continue rappelling down.
That is awesome.
Next slide. Next slide. And that's climbing, somebody, maybe me, climbing up to the top. Next slide. And when things got dull, we also tried caving. And this was in schoolhouse at the jumping off place. What really bothered me though is later on there's a route which goes to the judgment seat way in the back, and it involves a traverse very high up along a ledge. And the easiest way of doing that is to walk near the very edge of the ledge, which was seemingly overhung. And you were hesitant to do that because it all looked like clay. And I remember feeling very uncomfortable, and I sort of stuck in 1 or 2 pitons into the clay. Maybe I drove them a little bit, but it had a nice feeling of seeing that the rope was apparently anchored. And also we had carbide lamps, which means like when you were doing a rappel, you had to remember to keep your head away from the rope so you didn't melt the rope. Okay, next slide. Oh, by the way, then of course when you got back to Armentrout's campground, you just sort of stripped down and took the ropes and took a bath for yourself and the rope to clean it of all the mud. Next slide. Oh, okay, that was Buck Harper. Okay. So he kept us all in line. Oh yeah, one thing about that time too, the mountaineering section was interested in getting a cabin, and we had planned. I had drawn some plans for a prefabricated cabin that'd be across the river at where the bridge is, a little to the right, a little to the south, I guess. And Buck said, "Hey, I know the farmer that he may want to sell that." So we contacted the farmer and and we agreed on a price and signed a contract and all that. And we thought, this is really great. We'll have a cabin right there at the foot of Roy Gap Road. And it turned out that he then showed the contract to the Forest Service, because the Forest Service had decided they really wanted all that. And there was a little bit of haggling as to what was really the value. And with Mountaineering Section's generous offer, the farmer was able to establish a rather nice price for the piece of land that and other acres that the Forest Service wanted. So we were naive. He sold his land at a nice price, and we didn't get anything. Next. And this is me started with Henshaw doing the horrendous traverse. Next slide. Same thing, still on, moving over. Next slide. That's Henshaw. Next slide. And this is, I'm sitting on, let's see, well,
Marshall's Magnets?
there, that's me. I'm sitting on a little outside corner ledge, and Bob Henshaw coming right, coming across. Next slide. Bob Henshaw again, and this is at the, where is it? Right in the corner where the Pleasant Overhangs starts. I came up first, and it turned out that that ledge where Henshaw is was a pigeon roost. And I must have cleaned off at least a foot or more of pigeon droppings. Anyway, that's so everybody that's belays for that can thank me for that. It was a real mess. Anyway, that was an attempt. We were trying to figure out a way of doing Thais. So it ended up that's how there was a Thais escape route. Next slide. Oh, this is on the second ascent of Thais. I was obviously busy all that time. And that's Phil Carden and his wife, Joan Carden. And by the way, this, in the guidebooks, it shows there's the Kaufman-Carden route, and then there's another place where a slide that shows no, let's see, how is that? There's another route where Kaufman's Rib. And just in the guidebook that says Kaufman and Party. Well, what do you call it? Right there.
John.
What?
Phil.
Yeah, Phil Carden was the party. So that could give a little more credit to Carden's, Kaufman's route. Anyway, next slide. Tommy Marshall in winter on South Peak.
Great.
Yeah.
That's a great picture.
Next slide. This is a very controversial little episode. The guidebook for Marshall's Madness says, gives Kaufman credit as being part of the party. That's untrue. Is Tommy Marshall and I were the only people on the route, or making the route. I figured out what the route should be. I got Tommy Marshall because he was younger and stronger. And, well, you know, route finding is one of the most difficult things to do. So once you have that out of the way, then it's so you find some young teenager and have him lead it. So he led it, and I barely managed to follow. And this route, this picture, if you see Kaufman, stupid thing here. Okay, here. That's Kaufman. He's on one rope, which is this one rope that he has his hand on going down here to Phil Carden, who is his belayer. This rope up here is not touching Andy Kaufman at all. Goes up here and over to Marshall. I meant to Tommy, and I'm on this end of the rope belaying. So this is what is caused confusion by guidebook writers who thought that Kaufman was really on this same rope as part of the Marshall's Madness. So guidebooks sometimes get mixed up. Next slide. Sometimes climbing is really not that difficult if you go. It's only your viewpoint. Okay, that's Marshall going. You can see the rope here and going over, and then he continues up. Next slide. Damn.
So you're belaying from the base of Triple S?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, there he's up. So he's switched over to a different crack system. Next slide. And this is Markwell and his shop. Notice the difference in hardware.
And the difference in Markwell.
Yeah. So you can see pitons were still the favorite. There's these new things, these nuts over off to the side. Okay, next slide. This is Arnold Wexler's climbing gear. So you really don't need, by the way, none of us had helmets. None of us had I think quite the come on, the harness and for holding the gear, we had like quarter-inch parachute cord was what we used to hang our gear off. And this is all Arnold would climb with. He didn't need anything more. So, pardon? I didn't hear that.
3 carabiners.
Yes.
4, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's as much as you'd put in for a half a rope length or so. Because another thing, you didn't have to do full 120-foot or 100-foot leads because you'd get out of contact with your belayer. And so short leads were more common so that your belayer and the leader could communicate. Next slide. And we did take about 5 of us took a trip off to the Tetons and Tower of Devil's Tower, and this was at a time when not many people had climbed it. We were the 37th crowd to have done it, and the park superintendent and his wife came out and posed in front of their tower. Next slide. That's Frank Sauber having a little trouble getting over the lip. And you can see the Blair shoe, that's Joel Gross's tennis shoe, not tennis, sneaker. And so no helmets, no harness. Next slide. And the top, myself on the left, Chuck Wedling in the center, and Joel Gross on the right. And I'm looking a little perturbed because of the storm coming up. And there are 5 of us, and 4 of us. And I wanted to get us down as soon as possible since I had to be the last guy and I had a lot of hardware. And I didn't like the idea of lightning. So next slide. Now this is the green wall. Jimmy Shipley, there were 3 of us. Jimmy Shipley, right there, myself in the middle, and Alan Talbert on the end. And that way I was able to take photographs and sometimes exchange leads with Jimmy. Next slide. That's Alan Talbert climbing. Notice all the lichens. Sometimes I think climbing with lichens is easier because there's more friction. And probably all that stuff is worn off by now. Next slide. Alan Talbert had a very nice way of being relaxed while waiting for Jimmy and I to climb. And so he's not, well, let's see, I guess, yeah, he is anchored in once. Yeah. Next slide. Jimmy, belaying. Yeah. Again, you can see tennis shoes, not tennis, sneakers, no helmet, no harness. Next slide. near the very end, that little traverse off to the north. Oh, and somebody was asking what hardware we were using. And yes, we were using pitons. Right, there's one right there. So, yeah. Next slide. And Markwell and I on initiation on the south side, south pillar. And I think we were using pitons there too, it looks like. Oh, yeah, and there's my Kletterschuhe, which I imported. No, those are our RBs, I think. They came later. Next slide. Now that is John Markwell's dog named Prune. And that was the name of, that dog was the reason we named that climb Prune. Because it just happened to like it. And by the way, there's a place where on the first pitch, I was about 2/3 of the way up the first pitch, I was beginning to feel uncomfortable, and the only thing I could see to put for protection was there was a horizontal flake, and I saw that there's an old Army ring piton stuck vertically down behind that flake, and I just clipped into it immediately. And I went on my merry way, and it was all right. And because I wasn't going to use it for protection, I was just using psychological benefit. And Arnold then shows it to me as he had lifted it up and out. He didn't even have to pull it. He just lifted it out, and half of that long 6-inch angle piton had rusted away. And well, that wasn't so bad. The thing is that the ring itself was always the most notorious thing to fail, but it got me by. Anyway, next slide. Oh, and then I found that I was really beginning to want to follow in the footsteps of the mountaineering section old-timers who really were using all this rock climbing around here as a way of getting in condition to go to the Canadian Rockies and the interior ranges. That group, or the mountaineering section of the old-timers, did something like 100 first ascents in those Canadian mountains because they had more leave time annually than their counterparts in Canada. Being career employees, they had like a 5-week vacation, and so they could go into these very remote areas, and that meant walking in and cutting with machetes, a devil's club, and frequently finding they were in the wrong valley because the maps would just show, the contour maps would show big areas of contours, and then there'd be some areas which had no contours, and maybe a little X saying, signifying that there's a peak here, and that was unclimbed, and they wanted to get to that peak. And so you had no way of knowing what valley to go up. And there were some trips that they made were just didn't achieve anything. Anyway, that made me feel interested in the Canadian mountains. And this is Mount Louis, just outside of Banff. And it's a great climb. And the interesting thing about it is that the original the original climb was done in an afternoon by a very well-known Canadian guide, and you just follow the logical route up here until you got to where it got really steep. Then you looked over this way and found that there's a route that could go up the middle of that spire. And the interesting thing is that as you went up this easier part, that there are people who did not know how to read the rock, and they ended up getting benighted. And there were all sorts of little crude stone shelters which they huddled underneath for a night. And they made it into like a two-day climb. And if you read the rock right, then you can find a route that was easy to do and do it in an afternoon. So then I got into, let's see, Pierre Duray, and I forget the other couple's name. I thought it would be good to go into a peak called Eris, which was the north face of it was a gigantic anticline, and it looked like a tapestry. And the surveyors who were naming the peaks called it Eris, named after a Belgian town which was famous for its tapestries. So a bit of intellectual background enabled this surveyor to put the right name with a double meaning. Oh, it's also, Eris was one of the big towns where the Canadian Army was fighting World War I in. There were a bunch of peaks in this area that are named for the various battles. And so I thought it would be a great peak to do, and so I convinced everybody, the four of us, that we should get hellied into it, climb the peak, and then walk out, because we'd be very motivated to walk out. But if we did it in reverse, if we walked in, it would be very possible that we'd get distracted with other peaks. It was in the Mummery area, and we might not get to our objective. So as a helicopter pilot flew us in, we had to go over 4 mountain passes, and he said, oh, that's going to be interesting to get it over. And sure enough, on the way back, it was interesting to get over. I climbed up to the Bergschrund and was standing in the Bergschrund doing a traverse, and I fell backwards from my pack, and Pierre Duray came over and had to just grab my chest strap and heave me upright again. So I was able to do the traverse and finish and get over to the pass. And then coming down the other side was a big Bergschrund with snow bridges. And the only logical way of deciding how to get across the snow bridges was to send the most inexperienced and also the heaviest person first, because the other three of us had some experience in how to pull people out of crevasses. So we sent this guy over, and he probed with his ice axe as he's supposed to do, and the ice axe would go through the snow bridge, and he did this 3 or 4 times, and he said, shit, I'm not going to do any more of this. And so then it falls that, well, I'm the leader, so I've got to do it. And so there's a little trick I decided I'd better use, and that was to move over to where the snow bridge looked good, and then take my pack off, tie a piece of parachute cord on the end of it, and push it ahead of me, and lay down on my belly, and crawl, well, sniggle across the snow bridge, pushing the pack ahead of me. And by distributing all my weight, my whole body weight across the snow bridge and pushing the pack ahead, the snow bridge held. So everybody else did that, and we got across that. So anyway, that was a major bit of excitement about that.
Do you want me to tell part 2?
Pardon?
Do you want me to tell part 2?
Okay, yes.
Okay, part 2, John, I've been with John for a number of years, and he was always talking about this story about when they went in to do Mount Eris, and how this helicopter pilot dropped him off and said, I don't know how the hell you're going to get out of here, and look down there at that path, you're not going to get across that. And they all, they got dropped off, but the helicopter pilot was very concerned about them. And so then I heard the story of how they got out and the big whoopie-doo or whatever. Well, then about, I don't know, it's been over 10 years ago, maybe around 2006 07, 08. John and I are in British Columbia, and we are helicoptering in with a couple other people from Golden to the Mistaya Lodge, okay? And I don't know, it's like a 20 or 30-minute helicopter flight. And John and I are sitting in the back, and the pilot is sitting in the front. We all have our headsets on, communicating that way. And the pilot, John's saying like, "Oh, over there is the mummering range, blah, blah, blah." And the pilot's saying, "Yes, yes." And John said, many years ago, I was helicoptered in to do a peek back there, and with 3 other people, and the pilot didn't think we were going to get out, okay? And the pilot, this is, the 4 of us are in the helicopter now, and the pilot's like flying along going, "Oh my God." And he turns around and he goes, "I was your pilot." Okay, and he goes, "I don't believe that." And he goes, "That was my first summer as a helicopter pilot. I was very young, and you were some of my first clients." So then he goes, "So what happened? How did you get out?" And the others of us in the helicopter are like going, "Let's talk about this when we land." The pilot was like flying along, and it was very sweet because once they landed at Mistaya Lodge, they just got out and embraced, and it was just very ironic that, John's telling the story about and the pilot was like, "So tell me, how did you get out?" This is like 30 years later.
Okay, so next slide. Oh, that was it. Oh, no, okay. That is somebody somewhere in the Canadian mountains. It's all to say that, hey, this, you can find some interesting things to climb out there.
Alpine Club of Canada.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and the Alpine Club of Canada has summer climbing camps, which they will heli you in, take all your gear in, you just walk in maybe, and they will, if you haven't ever climbed mountains before or are unfamiliar with snow, they will give you a day's instruction of how to use an ice axe, how to do a self-arrest with an ice axe, and a few other basic things. And for the most part, if you really show that you've got some skill, they'll let you go off by yourself and do it with your own partners and climb something. And otherwise, they will very quickly, after the first day, sort you into groups as who has enough experience or not so much experience. And that depends on more interesting things that are climbed. Next slide. And this is July. July and August, you still will have a lot of snow up there. And the peaks are only 10 or 11,000 as opposed to 14,000 in the U.S. Another slide, another picture. Oh, I guess that's it. Yeah, that's it.